Okay, we are right at the top of the hour, so we're going to go on and get started. I would first like to thank everyone for taking time out of their very busy schedules to join us today as we continue down the road to HIPAA compliance. Today's session will be covering training the workforce. Just to give you a brief background about Kirkpatrick Price, we are a licensed CPA and PCI QSA firm specializing in information security and regulatory compliance audits, providing assurance services to over 400 clients in more than 46 states, Canada, Asia, and Europe. The firm has over 11 years of experience in compliance frameworks such as HIPAA and HITECH, ISO 27001, and 27799, and NIST. We offer both regulatory compliance and information security services. We also provide consulting services such as policy and procedure drafting, risk assessment, internal audit plan and development, and readiness audits. We also provide guidance and audit services on frameworks such as HIPAA, SSA 16, SOC 2, PCI, FISMA, and ISO 27001, 27002. Just a few of our normal housekeeping items I want to go over before we get started. This session is being recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slides following the presentation. And everyone who has attended today will also receive CCB Continuing Education Credit Certificates probably sometime tomorrow afternoon. So be sure to look for those in your inbox. All attendees will remain muted throughout the session, so we do encourage everyone to ask questions using the Q&A feature, which is located on the WebEx toolbar. I'll be monitoring those throughout the hour, and we do have some time reserved to address those at the end. I also wanted to take a quick moment and invite you to connect with us. You can subscribe to our blog for regular industry updates, tips, and best practices. We also keep a library of our recorded webinars located on our website, so if there's one in the series that you found particularly interesting but weren't able to make, you can view those there on our webinars page on our website. And LinkedIn is another great way to stay in touch with us. We're always posting about upcoming events and industry news on there, so be sure to find us on LinkedIn as well. I would now like to introduce our speaker, Mark Heinley. Mark is a regulatory compliance specialist with Kirkpatrick Price and a member of the Florida Bar with 9 years of experience in healthcare law, regulatory affairs, and internal compliance in the public and private sectors. His specific experience includes serving in the General Counsel's Office for a state healthcare oversight agency, regulatory affairs for Medicare, Medicaid, HMO, and complex healthcare litigation. He is also SAM certified in the law of data security and investigations. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome to everyone else who's attending this webinar. We appreciate your participation, and I look forward to sharing this topic of training the workforce with you today. I also have to provide some housekeeping. This presentation is provided by Kirkpatrick Price for educational or informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Therefore, no attorney-client relationship is established by viewing this presentation, and should you need legal advice, please consult with your own attorney. So now that we have that out of the way, I want to introduce our topic today and give you a little bit of background about training the workforce with respect to HIPAA compliance. And by way of background, just start with the idea that HIPAA training is fun. You know, nothing better than to start our conversation with than a flat-out lie to build some credibility. Now, I know that training and HIPAA training is perhaps one of the least popular HIPAA compliance topics. And that's because employees may view HIPAA as a barrier to their work, and then more specifically, they may view training as a boring interruption to their jobs that they have to do when they're hired and then, you know, at some frequency thereafter. And it may not just be employees that view HIPAA and HIPAA training that way. Management may also view HIPAA as a barrier to actually doing work, performing services, providing care, and then more specifically may also view HIPAA training as a barrier. And therefore, sometimes HIPAA training can be relegated to just doing the minimum necessary to get by. And so I want to acknowledge the challenge of getting buy-in to HIPAA training, but if it's not fun, then at least we can acknowledge that HIPAA training is required. Both the privacy and security rules have training requirements, And even between those two rules, the training requirements differ from each other. And just to state out front, the training requirements in the security rule apply to both covered entities and business associates. So even if HIPAA training is viewed as one of the least enjoyable things that someone can do at their job, it's still required by both the privacy and security rules, and it applies from the security rule perspective to both covered entities and business associates. And if stating that HIPAA training is required doesn't do a whole lot to generate buy-in, then we can also at least throw in there that HIPAA training is key. The HHS Office of the Inspector General says that an effective training program is one of the keys to an effective HIPAA compliance program. So we can acknowledge the challenge of getting people to sit through presentations on PHI and password management and security awareness, but we can at least bring to the table the notions that it's both required by law and it's a core component to ensuring enterprise-wide compliance with HIPAA. So while we've got that part out of the way, let's talk about a couple of different components to HIPAA training. The first is the idea that HIPAA training is flexible, that there's flexibility to it. There are some specific training requirements, particularly within the security rule and even within the privacy rule. There are some statements that provide guidance. But like the security rule, the approach is for the training requirements to be flexible and scalable, acknowledging that all different kinds of entities of all different sizes and all different maturities will be required to implement HIPAA training. And so the security and privacy rule are flexible and scalable to some degree, and therefore the training to support those rules is flexible and scalable. The second part of our overview that's important to acknowledge is the training goals. The goal of HIPAA training is the same as HIPAA itself, and that's to protect the privacy and security of information. And the HIPAA training is not just to advise employees about different laws. Most employees don't need to know the bulk of the specific legal requirements that HIPAA requires covered entities and business associates to comply with. Most employees don't need to know all of the details about a time period to report a breach or breach mitigation or communication to affected patients. They do need to know about the concept of a breach and what happens afterwards, but they don't necessarily need to know all of the details. And in fact, HIPAA's training requirements doesn't even technically require entities that are subject to it to understand HIPAA. The privacy rule actually requires covered entities to make sure that its employees understand the company's policies and procedures with respect to PHI. So for example, password management is a basic component of any information security program, whether that information security program is specific to a healthcare entity that's dealing with PHI or a financial or sales or some other product information that a company wants to maintain as confidential. So the concept of passwords management goes beyond just HIPAA and the protection of PHI. And the concept of password management is going to look different from entity to entity, even if there's going to be some similarities. So what the privacy rule actually requires is not just that employees understand what HIPAA says about password management. It actually requires that employees understand what an entity says about password management. And that's an important distinction as we go down into some of the specifics, some of the specific items that should be covered in HIPAA training. And so for the security rule requires security awareness and a training program with some specific elements. But again, it is not just to identify a list of regulations and citations. It is to make individuals not only aware of policies and procedures under the privacy rule, but aware of the security controls that an entity has to protect the confidentiality and availability and integrity of PHI. And then, so finally, using regulatory text and legal jargon is not a very effective way to implement HIPAA training. I think it just creates confusion, and it furthers the impression that some have that HIPAA is something for legal and compliance associates to deal with, but it doesn't really apply on a day-to-day, task-by-task basis to everybody else. So we want to acknowledge that HIPAA training requirements are flexible and scalable to each entity as long as they meet some basic components that I said we're going to talk about. And then we also want to make sure that our training has the end goal in mind, and that is to protect the privacy and security of information, and not just to convey a list of different laws. So now that we've talked about those two different components of HIPAA training, let's talk about two different approaches that we can take to HIPAA training. So one of those approaches is kind of a one-size-fits-all, where you can purchase a training in a box kind of solution that's all over the place online, and that has some value. Someone else has already done the work for you if you have limited resources or limited expertise, and that someone might know what they're talking about. So they've given you, if not a great starting point, at least, if not everything, they've given you a great starting point for HIPAA training. But that kind of one-size-fits-all where you just take documentation or PowerPoint slides or video or a recording and set that in front of your employees and hit play or ask them to read it, has some downsides to it. It might be lacking some key information that applies to all HIPAA training, and it certainly has the potential to be missing some items that are specific to your organization. And that lack of customization matters because the privacy rule says that training the workforce is supposed to be done as necessary and appropriate to carry out the workforce's function. And that language at the end is important, because if the training that we provide to our employees talks about HIPAA and talks about PHI, but doesn't get down to providing enough information to help employees understand how carrying out their specific function relates to the protection of health information, then that training isn't effective and probably isn't compliant. And obviously, as functions differ from one organization to another organization, or even within organizations, training needs to be somewhat targeted. So the training that a small provider's office is going to implement is going to look different from a clearinghouse or a third-party administrator or a document storage and destruction provider or a university medical system or a software provider, law firm, hospital group, or EOB vendor. So if one-size-fits-all kind of training in a box isn't either a viable solution or a total solution, what kind of solution can we implement for, or what kind of method can we use for HIPAA training? And I would recommend asking a couple of questions as a way of establishing your own, creating your own HIPAA training. First, how do we receive and use and transmit PHI? And the answer to that question provides guidance with how to develop and implement training. Let me give you at least one example to see if this will help explain this concept. So a small provider group is going to receive and use and transmit PHI to patients and to other providers very frequently in a physical setting, in an office setting, whereas a software provider that has access to patient records is likely to have exclusively electronic or digital access to PHI. And so the means of receiving and using and transmitting PHI between a small provider group and a software provider with access to patient records is very, very different. And so obviously the training should be different for those two different kinds of entities. And then the second question is, where is our risk? Where are we subject to potential fraud and exposure? And again, that's going to be different depending on the kind of services that an entity provides. And so the biggest area of risk for any HIPAA compliant entity is going to be the people. It doesn't matter what kind of services we're providing, or whether we're a covered entity or a business associate, it's always people that are the greatest risk for inadvertent or intentional disclosure or access or transmittal of PHI. So going back to our small group provider versus our software provider example, a small group provider's concerns about its people and the potential risk for HIPAA violations are going to be probably more about inadvertent disclosures in a physical office setting, where someone writes a note or puts a note on a patient's folder, which has happened, that indicated that they were a patient that had AIDS in a bright red sticker that was visible to other people. That's going to be a very different kind of risk concern than a software provider who's going to be concerned more about the vulnerability to the software, maybe the vulnerability to the software provider's servers and or cloud services, or maybe even some of the physical security within the software provider's main office. So asking those questions and then answering those questions is going to provide a different answer for a small provider group than it is for a software provider. So still dealing with PHI, still dealing with the security and privacy rule, depending on whether it's a business associate or a covered entity, but different areas of concern and different methods of receiving, using, and transmitting PHI. So I want to acknowledge that there is, training in a box, and that kind of solution can provide some utility. But I also think it's important to identify that the privacy rule and even the language in the security rule indicates that training needs to be specific to our organization. And so one of the ways to both be practical in protecting PHI, but also striving for compliance, is to ask these two questions. How do we receive, use, and transmit PHI first? And then second, where is our risk? Now that we've talked about those two different kinds of approach to HIPAA training generally, I want to get into some specific required elements. Something that you should include should be found whether you're getting something from training in a box or whether you're creating your own custom training program. The first of those 5 different items is the concept of universal application. That is, everyone is subject to HIPAA training requirements. And that's the basis for all information security training standards. So this isn't just something that's subject, particular to HIPAA training, but this is something that any effective or useful information security standard should have. That is, everybody is subject to the training and everyone is a part of maintaining the confidentiality of protected health information. And just to show that's not just a best practice, but to identify that's required by both the privacy rule and the security rule. The privacy rule says that entities must train all members of its workforce, and the security rule says that entities must implement a security awareness training program for all members. So HIPAA training is not just for staff who interact with patients or other particularly limited job roles that people might intuitively think are going to be dealing with PHI and disclosing PHI. This is something that is, this being the HIPAA training, is something that is a requirement for all personnel at any kind of entity. So a business associate that might have some individuals that might rarely have access to PHI are still subject to the requirement to receive HIPAA training. So the first of those required elements for any compliant and effective HIPAA training program is that everyone is subject to it. The second is identifying what PHI means to an entity. So every entity is going to have to identify those elements of PHI, and it's usually going to be all of them, but there are going to be times where it might be particular to identify how different associates are going to use and access and transmit which different components of PHI, so that they're aware of risks and responsibilities. So some business associates, for example, are going to have information that is generally considered protected in other contexts, names and social security numbers and addresses, but are also going to be covered by HIPAA. So if a business associate is doing providing services to a covered entity, but it's also providing services to, a financial organization or a nonprofit or some other organizations where that same kind of information is names and addresses and other information is provided by all of those entities. Then an effective and compliant HIPAA training program is going to convey to its associates that PHI has a different level, a greater level of care than perhaps the same information provided to different non-healthcare related entities. The third of those required elements is the concept of minimum necessary. And to understand that, we should note that the privacy rule says that PHI should not be used or disclosed when that PHI is not necessary to satisfy a specific purpose or to carry out a function. Now, there's exceptions to that, but an effective and compliant HIPAA training program is going to convey to associates that just because there is authorized access to PHI generally doesn't mean all PHI in all cases should always be shared to all people. So one of the ways to address this, again, going back to the model of asking questions to get answers that are most effective for our entities, particularly for this concept of minimum necessary, ask two questions. What PHI do we normally disclose for this task? And what do we do about exceptions? I think it might be helpful, again, to give a couple of different examples. So if someone was, as a part of their regular job function, calls patients to provide them with information, including things like appointments or even details related to medical conditions and treatments, then leaving a voicemail might be a normal part of their job task. But it's important to identify within leaving a voicemail, even if that's normal, what kind of PHI is appropriate to leave on a voicemail. Because just because an employee normally calls people and shares PHI doesn't mean that all PHI should be shared or that PHI should be shared over voicemail or to people in all circumstances. Or another example would be where someone sends an entire medical record to an entity for the purpose of billing for one service. So it's normal to share medical information from a covered entity to a billing entity in order to get paid for that service, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all of the medical records should be provided to that billing entity. So a covered entity is going to have to ask themselves, what information does this business associate need to do their job, and are we sending more information to that? And that's going to be part of the training program. You obviously can't cover every scenario for every employee in a generalized HIPAA training program, but you can establish the principles that your organization has established to be compliant with the minimum necessary requirement, and then you can also have more specific targeted training that addresses areas of greater risk to identify, what PHI does this role normally disclose or use or transmit, and then are there some exceptions to that normal disclosure, and do that for different areas of your organization in order to make sure that employees know and understand and comply with the concept of minimum necessary. The fourth concept or the required element for an effective and compliant HIPAA training program is the idea of authorization, that access to PHI must be authorized. So employees may only access or disclose a patient's PHI when the access is part of job duty. So this is kind of a corollary to the concept of minimum necessary, that you only disclose or use the PHI that is necessary to perform a task. And then the second level of that is you only access or disclose any PHI when that access is required to fulfill their job duties. So to give some real life examples of this concept, there was a Walgreens pharmacy employee who accessed the records of her husband's ex-girlfriend. So that pharmacy employee has within their job duties the requirement, the need to access PHI in order to fulfill their task. So this isn't a situation where someone shouldn't have had any access and did. This is a situation where someone needed access, but then they used it in a manner that wasn't consistent with their job duties. And as a result, they found out some information about the ex-girlfriend, and then there was some communication about some health information that most people wouldn't want to be shared. And as a result of that, Walgreens ended up paying over $1 million to the individual whose protected health information was accessed. So training should include job-specific and then situation-specific access guidance to PHI. As the privacy rule says, the training needs to be necessary and appropriate for members to carry out their functions. So the Walgreens example was a malicious one where someone intentionally accessed information for the purpose of finding something that they could use to get back at someone else. But other unauthorized access that is just curious access, just looking for things, is also impermissible. A couple of examples would be at a debt collection agency that's dealing with collection for medical bills, an agent just looking up the debt of a friend or a family member, or just browsing through accounts to look at information. Or to go back to our small provider's office, someone looking through a patient's records for a friend that they know is a patient at the practice, or a benefits administrator where someone is just looking through information, protected health information, to learn more about the kinds of information and the kinds of services that the benefits administrator provides. Even if that's an employee, even if that employee has some access authorization, if it's not for the purpose of fulfilling their job duties, then it's unauthorized and it's a violation of HIPAA. So to kind of wrap that point up, it's not just that we need to train employees on the concept that they only should access or disclose the minimum amount of PHI that's needed to perform a task, but we also need to convey the idea that employees should only be accessing or disclosing PHI when it's part of their job duties. The final of the 5 required elements that I've listed here is the most broad, and so we're going to spend quite a bit of time on this next topic of security awareness. There are some specific topics within this concept of security awareness, and then there are some general security awareness program elements that I'm going to recommend. And this comes straight from the requirement within the security rule to provide awareness of, to create a security awareness program. So there are 4 specific items within the training requirement from the security rule regarding this security awareness program. The first of those is a security reminder. This is an addressable requirement, but for all intents and purposes, this is going to be required. So this first one of security reminders is a requirement that covered entities and business associates alike provide periodic security updates that notify employees about changes in security policies or changes in security controls, security incidents, both internal incidents and then external incidents like that Walgreens example that I provided that might be useful to an entity, also about responsibilities of the entity and specific employees, as well as risks. These securities could also include instructions on how to use an entity's systems to protect PHI. Now, the methods of this kind of security reminder are varied. There are no specific requirements. You can use email or posters or letters or meetings or information that pops up on with sign-on messages to remind people about passwords and those kinds of things, or articles on an intranet solution. It's not about the specific ways that the security reminders are provided. It's just about ensuring that periodic security updates are provided to employees about various different aspects of an entity's security awareness program. The second specific item for a security awareness program training component should be is the protection from malicious software. So the most recognizable and relatable part of that is probably social engineering. So email messages that are potentially phishing attacks that are asking for someone to click a link or download a software or provide information are the kinds of things that are most likely to occur in an organization where someone's opening and sending emails. So training should advise and instruct employees on what social engineering is and how to read and process email that comes from unknown sources. The training should also include instructions about not bypassing any security role controls, including those controls related to email scanning, use of antivirus software, and training on reporting suspected malicious software. So first we have security reminders, and then second we have training on the protection from malicious software. The third specific required element for security awareness is the concept of training on login monitoring. So this requires entities, both covered entities and business associates, to implement procedures for monitoring login attempts and then reporting discrepancies. So the most simple and common way to understand this is the idea of a policy and then the training that goes along with it that says to employees, we lock you out of our systems, our secure systems, after 3 failed login attempts. And this training is at its core about proper login protocol and also proper reporting protocol. So making employees aware of activities that would be related to unauthorized login attempts. I think the best way to do that is to ensure that employees, report login, either actual discrepancies or suspected discrepancies, is to train employees on how to properly use secure login systems. And then once they understand the right way to use things, I think it's much easier for them to identify someone or something that's trying to log in inappropriately. The whole concept of, show someone how all the elements of a real legitimate dollar bill, and they'll be much more able to spot a fake dollar bill. So the fourth required element for security awareness training is password management. So this requires entities to provide training on creating and maintaining and changing passwords. This will involve, items that are particularly common and the subject of risk, but really boring to most people. But nevertheless, it's important for us to explain our standards for passwords, password strength, the frequency of password changes, to explain prohibited action with respect to passwords, things like writing passwords down or sharing passwords, and also the prohibition on using default or admin passwords. So the 4 specific elements that are mentioned in the security rule for security awareness training are security reminders, protection from malicious software, login monitoring, and then password management. But I think there are some other elements to security awareness training that are important to identify and include in order to be both effective and compliant. So what are those other elements? First, not just with respect to login monitoring, but across the board, training employees on what to do when something seems suspicious. If we've identified in our training and implemented a concept of how PHI should normally be disclosed, then I think, like I mentioned with login monitoring, our associates will be better able to identify when something is abnormal. So for example, a collection agency that has guidelines on verifying a right party before disclosing information that would be, dates of service or provider type. Those are the normal kinds of disclosure. Anything else would seem suspicious and then should be reported. Or, for example, a real-life example that related to some sanctions. There was a small practice where a specialist who handled records requests had someone come in and ask that records coordinator to put their PHI on a USB drive that they had brought in. And so that's the kind of thing that, providing records is something that a practice is going to deal with frequently, and so there's a lot of risk there. And when someone brings in their own USB drive, that should immediately raise a red flag. So just this general concept of identifying things that seem suspicious and then reporting those. Connected to that, but kind of an extension of that, is training employees on reporting breaches or suspected breaches. It's a requirement for covered entities and business associates to report breaches, so it's a requirement, therefore, to train associates on reporting those breaches. And a breach, and the training on breaches should include explaining what actually constitutes a breach. And the most common of those situations is a lost or stolen or improperly disposed of data. So a lost laptop or a stolen mobile device or paper records that were put in a trash can out back behind a location, weren't shredded, and just left in their entirety open to the public. An effective training program on breaches should also explain that a breach includes impermissible access, such as an outside breach by a hacker, or like I talked about with an email that was a phishing expedition. And it should also explain to employees that a breach can include impermissible disclosure of PHI through things like gossip. So when an individual learns of an unusual healthcare situation and they share that with a coworker or a friend who doesn't have authorization to access it, or something that's becoming more and more common and more of a risk, use of social media. So phones are everywhere, and people taking pictures of either purposefully or inadvertently of patients or PHI, and then posting that to Facebook and Instagram. So training for reporting breaches should include what constitutes a breach, and that would include proper access and disclosure, and then who to report to and how to report to that individual. Another topic that should be included in the security awareness program, and another topic that is increasing in its popularity and its risk, is the concept of remote work. And so an effective training program is going to address when telecommuting is permitted. There may be employees whose job function does not allow them to work remotely, or there may be employees whose job function allows them to work remotely in certain circumstances. And so when is remote work permissible? And then the second item would be, what are the controls that an entity has in place before removing media with PHI to conduct remote work? So that training is crucial, because if your organization uses laptops or tablets or phones, and those devices have PHI, and someone is rushing to get home at the end of the day, and they decide to take their laptop with them, there's all kinds of risk and exposure to that laptop or that device being lost or stolen or accessed by someone who doesn't have permission to do it. So it's important, as part of a security awareness program, to train employees on when remote work is permissible and what kind of controls are in place that have to be in place. So if a person brings in their own phone, or they have a laptop that's either their own or company provided, does that laptop have to have certain, VPN and some other antivirus software and other controls on that either installed or confirmed before that device is allowed to be used for remote work? And then finally, another item related to kind of that concept of remote work is training with respect to remote devices. So identifying what devices are permitted to be used for the transmission, receipt, or storage of PHI. If thumb drives are allowed or prohibited to be used for PHI, or other devices, providing training so that a workforce is aware of either blanket prohibitions or certain conditions and certain protocols for certain devices if they're permitted to transmit, receive, or store PHI. So those are 5 absolutely, I believe, required elements for an effective and compliant HIPAA training program. There may be more elements that are out there. As I mentioned, the rules, both the security and the privacy rule provide guidance, but they do not provide an absolute checklist that says here are the 15 or 20 things that must be included beyond some of the 4 items that I include in that security awareness training. It just, privacy rule says it's training that's necessary and appropriate for employees performing their job duties, and then the security rule talks about those 4 elements that I mentioned, plus the general concept of security awareness. So let's talk about a couple more general aspects of an effective and compliant HIPAA training program as we go forward. And I apologize, I believe that's a incorrectly placed slide. So if we can go to the next one. There we go. So one of the required and also challenging portions of an effective and compliant HIPAA training program is the concept of frequency. And this is both addressed in rule, but not completely addressed in rule. So the first of these 2 frequencies is addressed in rule, and that is HIPAA training should be provided upon hire. Specifically, the privacy rule says that training should be provided within a reasonable period of time after a person joins the workforce. And so covered entities are left with some discretion about determining what constitutes a reasonable period of time after someone joins a workforce. But generally, all employees should receive HIPAA training upon hire. The second of those 2 frequencies is when changes occur. So when an employee whose job functions are affected by a material change in policies or procedures, they should receive training. When there is a regulatory change or guidance on regulation that changes the way that PHI should be accessed or received or transmitted, then there should be training. If a covered entity or business associate changes its procedures or its controls, there should be additional training. So this is one of those items where we can't necessarily establish with some limitations that we may get to later, but it's not something where the security rule says that you have to provide training every quarter or every week or every month or twice a year. It simply requires entities, both covered entities and business associates, to be aware of when changes occur and align their training programs to changes in policy and procedure and regulation and services and other situations that would require a material that would have a material impact on job duties or security awareness. The next item is another requirement in addition to, and along with the concept of frequency, is the concept of documentation. So the privacy rule requires documentation of training, and in order to demonstrate that training has occurred for a third party or HHS OCR audit, you must have documentation of training. And that documentation should include 2 items, both the content of training, so we're talking about things like training curriculum, PowerPoint slides, recordings, videos, whatever we use to train our employees on all the items that we just talked about. That content should be retrievable for the purposes of an audit. And then the second documentation component should be acknowledgments. Who received training and when did they receive training? And that helps us to demonstrate that for covered entities, that we're in compliance with the privacy rules requirement within a reasonable period of time after the person joins the workforce. If we've got their hire date and their training date, then we can have a document, and then we can make a good argument for compliance with the privacy rule. So this is kind of the last catch-all portion of our presentation today regarding HIPAA training. What else is there besides the required elements, besides the different approaches, besides the requirements behind it, besides the frequency and the documentation? Here are three things that I think are important to consider when you're either purchasing or designing your HIPAA training program. The first of those is understanding and communicating the reason for behaviors that are addressed in training. So an effective training program educates employees on the why and not just the what. Why is it important to protect information? Why is it important to comply with our password management requirements? As I mentioned, password management is technical enough to make most people's eyes glaze over the moment those two words are mentioned. But if the concept is explained as part of the front line of information security and in terms of personal understanding, at least employees then might be able to appreciate the necessity of password management as a concept. So if we tell people why it's important to change the password every 30 days, why it's important to have strong passwords, why it's important not to write passwords down, I think we're more likely to get an engaged and compliant workforce. The second item is the concept of universal application of training. Beyond just employees, who else might we need to provide training to in order to be compliant and effective? So contractors or volunteers, anyone that might have access to PHI should be considered subject to HIPAA training. A university health system might even have to provide training to students who have access to PHI as interns or researchers, or just in general, there are some universities that have decided to provide HIPAA training to all students. So it's important to think broadly about the concept of universal application of HIPAA training to employees, and then go one step beyond that and say who else might have access to PHI, and then who else might we need to consider when we're designing and implementing our HIPAA training program. And then the last item is the concept of enterprise-wide feedback. Employees who receive training initially and who provide services on a day-to-day basis are a critical source for identifying areas where training needs to either be enhanced or revised or created from scratch. And so one of the ways to do that is just to accept feedback from them. Another is to document what questions our employees are consistently asking, and consider whether or not those questions indicate a deficiency in our HIPAA training program. Because it's one thing for either trainers or compliance associates or attorneys or senior management to design a HIPAA training program that is targeted enough to comply with the privacy rule and targeted enough to be specific, but even best efforts by those individuals might not address the things that employees are doing on a regular basis, and therefore might not be effective and compliant. So the last of those what else items, those three what else items, is to consider methods to obtain employee feedback and communication to employees as a part of training and as a part of ongoing communication throughout the company, that their feedback is valuable in making sure that training is the most effective that it can be. So I believe that will draw us to the conclusion of our presentation today before we get to the questions. In summary, don't overlook or underestimate the importance of HIPAA training, both from a purely regulatory perspective, but also as a key component of an effective HIPAA compliance program. Secondly, remember that as enticing as it is to get a training in a box program, that HIPAA was designed to have a flexibility of approach, acknowledging the different needs and sizes and services that covered entities and business associates are going to perform and have. So it's important to either create a HIPAA training program that is flexible and targeted towards not only your own organization, but also to some degree within your organization, the different roles that are applicable. But if you're buying something like Training in a Box, to adapt it to the extent possible to make sure that it addresses the requirements within the privacy rule and the risks that are particular to the risks and the use of PHI that are particular to our organizations. And then finally, while it's important to acknowledge the flexible approach of training, it's also important to remember that there are some basic required elements for all effective and compliant HIPAA training programs. So that concludes our presentation, but we do have time for a few questions.
Great. Thank you, Mark. I'd like to remind everyone that if you do have any questions, to go on and submit those using the Q&A feature. I did want to let everyone know that Kirkpatrick Price does offer online security awareness training through an online learning management system. We have several different course libraries for security and privacy training, and it's fairly cost efficient. Covers all kinds of topics like password management, physical security, social engineering, incident response, and a lot of the topics that we have talked about today. So if you have any interest in learning any more about that, I encourage you to shoot me an email, or you can email Mark and ask him, and he'll direct you to the right person to talk to you about that. Let's see. Okay, we do have a few questions. The first question, Mark, how much training do we need to provide to new employees upon hire?
So that's a question that gets asked frequently, and HIPAA does not, neither the security rule nor the privacy rule provide a specific answer for how much training is compliant. So I can answer it this way: 15 minutes of training is unlikely to provide enough information for someone to become aware of security risks and for someone to have the information needed to fulfill their job duties. On the other hand, training that lasts a couple of weeks or even all day might be overwhelming and leave employees more confused than when they started it. So the answer is to be thoughtful and, probably several hours at a minimum, and maybe up to a single day, but even then that could be overkill.
Great. All right, and let's see. Do we have to provide HIPAA training annually or security training?
Yeah, so the best practice is to provide training annually. That's an industry standard, again, to identify what goes on that impacts PHI, but also is just information security industry standards are. That kind of training, security awareness training, should be conducted on an annual basis. But if we're thinking about the training requirements, I think we're going to find that training is going to be done at least annually, if not more frequently. So if the answer is yes to any of the following questions, then we need to provide training. Did we have any security incidents since our last training? Were there any new regulations or guidance issued since our last training? Do we have any new services since our last training? Do we have any new relationships from the BA or covered entity side? Then if the answer to any of those is yes, then you probably need to do training. So I think what we'll find is, yeah, best practice is to provide some kind of formal across-the-board training, but I think we're going to find we're going to need to provide training more than just annually.
Great. Well, it looks like those are all of the questions that we have at this time. Let's see. I know you had a couple of resources that you wanted to share.
Yeah, so up on your screens are a couple of resources that might be useful for training, and these are both these are not Kirkpatrick Price's training, although, as Sarah mentioned, we have some that is particularly targeted, so that I think it can fulfill my encouragement to be tailored toward your organization. But these are both government training from Health IT, and then also on privacy and security training, And then the second link is the training that was provided. It's video recordings to state attorney generals. And so those videos are fairly long. Couldn't recommend those necessarily for, might not recommend those for all employees to undergo, but they might be resources good resources for creating and updating a HIPAA training program.
Great. Well, just to give you a heads up of what's coming up next month, we will be having a webinar covering incident response. And then in October, we are looking at the NIST cybersecurity framework, and in November, we'll be covering trends in enforcement activity. So if anyone has anything that they would specifically like to hear us cover related to HIPAA compliance, feel free to reach out to us, because we want to make sure that we are educating people on the things that they would most like to be educated on. So again, coming up next is incident response in September, so be on the look for those invitations. And if you have any further questions, you can contact Mark directly. His email address is located there on the screen. So I'll give everyone back the last 5 minutes of the hour, and thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.